Thank you very much for this wonderful bilingual introduction. I'm afraid that my French is not good enough to be also bilingual here this afternoon. But I hope that my English will be understandable for you. I will try not to speak too fast. Thank you also very much for inviting me here. I feel very honored and privileged. I know I'm the only foreign speaker, but perhaps there is more foreigners in the room. That would also be nice for me to know whether that is the case. Who is from abroad here, or are you all from France? No, it's really a French audience, which is really makes the privilege even greater. And perhaps you have read my abstract on the web page. And if you look at the title, which also Manuel just mentioned, you see a bit of a change in stress there. Indeed, I wanted to say something about those so-called fair data principles, because they are catching a lot of attention internationally, and I've been doing some thinking about them, and I was just very eager to share that with you and to hear also your opinion. But I want to begin with a few words, as was also in the abstract, about the kind of services that DANS is providing. And I know this must be a little bit of a silly acronym here in France, but in Dutch it is also silly, because in Dutch dans means dance, to dance, you know, and I know what dans means in French, but let us not bother about that too much. DANS is an institute of the Dutch Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Dutch Research Organization, Dutch Funding Research Organization. You see the acronyms there. We were created in 2005 with the mission to promote and to provide permanent access to digital research information. And note it says information there and not just data, although the majority of my talk will be on data. Earlier this morning we saw this nice graph on the screen of from data to information to knowledge, but I will not go into that in this talk. It is also good to know that our first predecessor goes back to 1964, when the Social Science Data Archive, the first social science data archive, was set up, the Steinmetz Foundation. And so we may say that we have now even more than 50 years of experience in this area. So to begin with a couple of our core services, and actually there is like 3 core services. One is called EASY, Electronic Archiving System, which is a system that researchers can use to deposit data, which we will then preserve, well, till as long as we can do that. I will not say eternity, that would be a bit blasphemous perhaps, but for as long as possible. The second service, core service, is DataverseNL, Dutch Dataverse. Dataverse is actually a software system developed at Harvard University for the archiving, or for the storing and sharing of research data. And we use that for short or intermediate term storage, as we found that especially the last few years there is an increasing demand for solutions to store data also during the research process and for the first 5 or 10 years afterward. Whereas EASY will preserve it even longer. And the third core service is called NARCIS, called after the flower, but it is also a very complicated acronym that I'm not going to reproduce here, which is a gateway to scholarly information in the Netherlands. It doesn't contain the actual data, but it contains metadata that is harvested from the academic and other higher education repositories in the Netherlands. And even I see that a couple of the numbers there are already outdated. It contains now about 1.3 million publications, about 40% of which are open access. It contains many more data sets than are there also from other organizations in the Netherlands that preserve and make available data. I didn't tell you that our core is in the humanities and the social sciences. And we collaborate with a couple of other organizations that cover other scientific fields as well. And together, we call that Research Data Netherlands, we are better able to service the whole research community across different disciplinary boundaries. And it contains other information as well. But there is more. I would call these additional services, although the first of which I would like to mention, the so-called data seal of approval, is perhaps not really a service, but the data seal of approval was at least invented at DANS. When DANS was set up, one of our tasks was to set quality guidelines for digital repositories for ourselves, but also we knew already from the beginning the world is not such that we can ever expect that all scientific data for all scientific fields would be in the DANS archives. So we'd better develop some quality measures that should be taken in other institutions as well that have perhaps for particular niches or other domains comparable functions. But we also thought from the beginning this should not be a local and even not a national enterprise. We should think more broadly and try to make it international as fast as possible. And in fact, it has been quite successful. I will return to the data seal of approval, I think, in one later slide. But already on the map that you can see there, you see those dots of places where the data seal of approval has been implemented. Well, we run a persistent identifier service, we give training and consultancy, but I will not dwell on those. And then over the past year, a couple of new, what I would call collaborative services have developed. And you should see, I see these as very important because actually I think we should collaborate in the provision of services. You shouldn't try to do everything yourself. You can't. Our budget, we have about 50 people working for DANS, is not growing as fast as the volumes of data are growing. We have to reach out and connect to other organizations to do things better. And one of the interesting collaborations that we started was even with the famous or sometimes infamous publisher Elsevier, which has acquired Mendeley data, or I would say Mendeley, and Mendeley has started a new service, Mendeley Data, as a data sharing platform. And we are quite proud actually that we were approached by Elsevier. They chose DANS as their background archive. We are going to be a dark archive for the data that is going to be shared through Mendeley. And the meaning of that is also that, of course, Elsevier is a commercial company. In case that they would stop such a service because it is not successful, then still the data will be safe, because in our contract is, in that case, DANS will become the data provider. Also, we ensured in the contract that we have with them that all data is to be open. Only for legal reasons it may be restricted, but not, it will be in no way so that Elsevier can restrict the access to the research data. So I think that is a very interesting new development. Then we have, since this summer, a collaboration with INRIA and not INIST, as I said over lunch. INRIA has recently set up a software heritage archive. One of our problems is that we get increasingly data sets that will become meaningless if the software that was created to manipulate or to work or to analyze that data is no longer available. But we do not have the means, the possibilities to set up our own software archive. It will just be an additional burden. But by teaming up, in this case with INRIA, we hope that we can still offer a software archiving service to Dutch researchers and that their software can also be safe in the internationally oriented software heritage archive. And then a third one, it was also mentioned in the introduction, is our new research data journal, by which we think by connecting articles to publications to data sets, well, it will enrich both. I've already said a few words on the easy long-term electronic archive, a few more words here to give you an idea of what it contains. It contains now some 32,500 data sets which are published, mainly from the humanities and the social sciences. Archaeology is interestingly disproportionately large, and that is because in that field is highly protocolized. And there is the support of the State Archaeological Service there, which makes it obligatory for researchers to store their data, not just the pottery and the other physical archaeological evidence. They have to store that as well, but in provincial physical archives. But the data sets are to be stored with DANS. And this is why this has grown so big. Not that I'm in favor of making everything obligatory, but I would say that it is very good if disciplines themselves develop protocols for data management and that they decide what would be good for that field in terms of data sharing. This graph gives an impression of data growth, and I should have updated this to 2016, I realize, but I can assure you that the growth is continuing, and so that has started from 2008. There seems to be the exponentiality of the curve seems to, how would I say, to become more linear again, but that has probably to do with our capacity to absorb data than with the demand for storing data. And you must know that every data set that is deposited is always checked by our staff, not in great depth, but at least whether it is not nonsense that is submitted, whether the metadata is okay, whether it's understandable for others, for reuse, what is there. It's also typical of our archive that we are in the long tail of research data. Again, we saw a graph earlier this morning about that, and this one, just as we are in this in the humanities and social sciences, is also not surprising. It's also interesting, I recently made this one. This includes the data till 2016, August 16, to be exact. That actually the trend is still the same, although we are starting to get larger data sets. The distribution doesn't change that much. It is also good to know that what used to be big data in the past, for instance, we have the complete Dutch population census for 1960 from the State Statistical Bureau. It's somewhere in the mid-range now, because that is just numbers, and that can be stored very efficiently. Whereas in the higher areas, it's usually not numbers, but it's video and audio and image information there. Access to the data sets is also growing. If you look at this graph, you can see that we are not talking about hundreds of thousands or of millions of downloads of data sets, but of tens of thousands. And that is also, I would say, in proportion to the size of the Dutch scholarly community. It is highly specialized data. It is not so interesting for the general public. It is interesting for researchers. We do get, for some data, some interest from the public, but usually we do have separate websites for that, so they do not count in this graph. And from the colors you can get an impression of the growth of open data, which is the green, the bottom section, which is gradually growing and quite fast actually. Although still registration is required for the majority of data sets, completely open, so-called Creative Commons Zero license waivers are there only for a few hundred so far. But that's growing as well. We recently started with that category. Now I will gradually move over to these so-called FAIR principles, and I start from the data seal of approval. It was already said that DANS was set up in 2005, and that we started also at that time by formulating quality guidelines for digital repository, including ourselves. And in 2006, we defined 5 basic principles, and they became the basis of 16 so-called DSA, or Data Seal of Approval guidelines. And in 2009, an international board was created to manage the Data Seal of Approval. And today, over 60 seals are granted worldwide, and many more are in progress. Organizations that do essentially a self-audit and then get a peer review by organizations already having the Data Seal of Approval. And upcoming is an integration of the Data Seal of Approval with the so-called World Data System requirements. And I guess the name hasn't been decided upon yet, but my vote would go for simply World Data Seal of Approval. So this started in 2006, right, this Data Seal of Approval thing. But in 2014 in Leiden, which happens to be the place where I live, but I wasn't at this meeting, a group of especially people from the life sciences came together to set a minimal set of community-agreed guiding principles to make data more easily discoverable, accessible, appropriately integrated and reusable, and adequately citable. And those developed into what are now known as the 4 FAIR data principles. So data should be findable, and I'm not going to read the whole sentence that is behind there, you can read it for yourself. Accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And now it is interesting to compare what we defined as the basic principles for the Data Seal of Approval with those FAIR principles. And there is a remarkable similarity there, although it is not perfect. Again, it would probably require a more thorough analysis to see exactly, and you would need to read the text to see in more detail what is the similarities and the differences. But I will mention for here just 1 or 2 aspects. That, for instance, the Data Seal of Approval says that data should be in a usable format, which certainly is an aspect of interoperability, but of course cannot be said that those 2 are exactly the same. And according to the Data Seal of Approval, data should be reliable, which is also not exactly the same as reusable. You could say that reliability is a condition for reuse, as it is in the FAIR principles. And remarkable enough, the citable, which was mentioned in the original FAIR text, is not included in the 4 letters, perhaps also because the acronym FAIR is just so beautiful that I didn't want a C there, and the C was included under the F of findable. And what has happened since then? Well, everybody seems to love FAIR. But what does that mean? Even we see in the most recent data management requirements for Horizon 2020, they are now called, there will be a slide on that a bit later on, the FAIR requirements for data management. I will return to that. So the idea was fantastic, and in a way so was the marketing of FAIR. But what was perhaps a bit lagging behind was, okay, it sounds great, but how do we implement those FAIR principles? What does it actually mean to be fair? And the group that started the initiative widened a bit, was organized, for instance, in the context of the Research Data Alliance and in the so-called Force 11 group, which originally set standard requirements for data citation. They also worked on the FAIR guiding principles, how to implement them, how to operationalize them. and 15 criteria have been formulated. Don't worry, I will return to them. And very recently, in March of this year, a very interesting paper was published in Nature Scientific Data about the FAIR principles, which I could recommend you to read if you haven't done so already. But then I started looking into the, how should I say, the dirty details. And the devil is always in the details, as a saying goes, at least in Dutch language. I don't know if that exists also in French. And I came across quite a few things that were a bit difficult. For instance, and this is generally so, in my opinion, it would be very good to have, if you have adopt these FAIR principles, it would be good to be able to rank data sets, to say, hey, this data set is less findable than that one, or this data set is more openly accessible than that one. But that isn't in the operationalization as it stands now. And I found quite a few instances where I have the feeling, at least, that things are under two headings or refer to each other, which make the findability, for instance, partly dependent on the accessibility or vice versa, which I also found quite complicating. I think there is not really, this is not the opportunity to go into all the details here in the discussion. That would require much more time. But we could continue to the other operationalizations of the other letters, interoperable and reusable as well. And there also I have at least a couple of questions to which I really do not know what the answer could or should be. So there is a couple of, I would say, unresolved FAIR complications. And I sum them up here. There is a couple of dependencies among the dimensions. It is difficult to measure the criteria. You cannot rank order them from low to high. And sometimes the grouping of criteria under dimensions is disputable. That is my first criticism, so to speak. Second, there appears to be some confusion also internationally and among all kinds of groups who say, hey, FAIR is a good idea. For instance, there is the question whether openness should be a separate dimension, not included in FAIR. This is what the FAIR, original FAIR group itself says. And it could be questions whether it would be desirable or possible to say something about the substantive data quality, such as the accuracy or the precision or the correctness of the data. Personally, I think this is not possible, and I would not do so unless, and the unless will follow. And third, still under number 2, the third bullet under 2, what about the long-term access? For how long does data remain fair? This time aspect is also not really addressed. And you could also question yourself, should data security be included? If you would answer all those questions with yes, then of course you get much more than just fair. And I'm not sure whether that is wise. The third issue is, do we need separate FAIR criteria for different disciplines? Also this morning in the discussion we saw that in different disciplines there is indeed quite a variety. So there may be something to say about that, although there is communality as well. But to mention one thing very explicitly, in the life sciences, it is seen as very important that the data is machine actionable, that the data can be, by machines, can be reused, so to say, not just by humans, but by computer programs. But in other fields, this is much less important. So perhaps it still makes sense to have different operationalizations of FAIR in some areas in comparison to others. Now, I already said that in the the latest Horizon 2020 guidelines on fair data management, indeed this concept of fair has been introduced. I think I'm doing more or less fine, time-wise. And they say they also have their interpretation of fair. They do that in the form of questions. And without going into all the detail here, there is a total of 23 questions on fair, and there is 16 additional questions, although I've gone through them. I think at least 5 of them actually should also be ranked as fair questions. But that is a lot. This may result in something that we weren't after, in a lot of red tape, into researchers getting into despair, thinking that they have to go through to jump through another loop before they can get a project funded. It will be like a paper tiger. So I think we should go and aim for a more simple solution. And perhaps it makes a lot of sense to combine the ideas of the data seal of approval and FAIR. And also we could use those criteria as quality criteria. Perhaps not quality in the sense of that we know that data is good or right or accurate, because that is very difficult to establish, but that at least a couple of marginal conditions are met that describe more the process in which the data was collected and worked with. So I would like to keep it simple and straightforward. How could it work? First of all, I would like each FAIR principle as a separate dimension of data quality, and interaction effects only complicate things, so I would like to get rid of those. I would like to score the data, the fairness of the data, on each dimension, for instance from 1 to 5. And then you could have a total score of fairness as an indicator of data quality. And you could be a 3, a 4, or a 2. It is not so nice. Perhaps you could rank it like with stars, or from bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and diamond. For instance, data set X could have the FAIR profile findable 3, A3, I4, R2, meaning it is fairly findable, it is accessible on restrictions, it is almost optimally interoperable, but its reusability is not terribly high. And then a total FAIR score would be, in this case, 3, it would still be gold. So still fairly good, I would say, on a scale of 1 to 5. And there is another example there for you to look at. So now at my proposal of what we could do, and for want of time, I cannot go into all the 4 letters and to specify them. And perhaps, by the way, this is how my thinking stands now. This is also the first time I'm presenting those ideas in a public audience. So I really think that this needs more discussion before saying this is good or this is not good. But for instance, to look at findable, which is defined by metadata, documentation, and because FAIR puts citability also under the F, it should also have to do with an identifier for citation. So you could rank data from no persistent identifier and no documentation at all to the highest, extensive metadata, of course also an identifier, and rich additional documentation available. And you could do similar things with the other FAIR letters. For accessible is defined by, well, in my opinion, the presence of a user license. A license says usually under what conditions data is accessible or may be reused. There is some confusion here. The FAIR group itself would like to put licenses under the R of reuse. It is to be debated. I don't know. I like it here. You could also put it is in a way a semantic question, you could also put it under reuse, but I have another idea about reuse. Interoperable is defined primarily by the data format, as was also the case in the data seal of approval. But we could extend that and use a modified version of Tim Berners-Lee 5-star open data plan for interoperability. Reusable is, I think, the most difficult dimension, partly also because it is certainly also subjective. You can never describe use in objective terms only. It always also depends on what you want to do with the data, whether you can use them or not. You cannot have an objective reusability. This is also why I'm certainly not yet finished in my own thinking with this last aspect. To sum up, I do think that the data seal of approval and FAIR principles are a perfect couple for quality assessment of research data and trustworthy data repositories. We have started working on the operationalization, and the idea would be that every data set that enters the archive would be assessed by our staff in terms of fairness, to get an initial stamp of how findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable the data is. But then data will be reused, and the users will also be asked to give their opinion on the data. So they will give a review of the data, and which will make the fairness of a data set a living thing. It is not forever, as it is, evaluated by just 1 or 2 persons, but the more people reuse it and give their impression, the better the, I would say, the verdict will be. And ideally, any trusted archive which is certified according to the data seal of approval, or soon the World Data Set of Approval, will contain fair data. And that is where my talk ends. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, any question? Well, if not immediate, yes? Okay, yeah, this side.
And here in the second one.
Okay, another one. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for this talk, which is really interesting. I was wondering, we also hold what a difficult work and what a challenge it is to archive data. And as we saw at the beginning of your presentation, you're mainly dealing with data to store them in a way for short-term or mid-term. How do you imagine a long-term preservation for data, and on what type of criteria? Because we can imagine that it is difficult to imagine to long-term archive all the data that you may have.
Perhaps I didn't state that so clearly, but we do have 2 different services. One for short or intermediate term storage, which is based on Dataverse, and one for long-term preservation. Perhaps I said as long as we can, to be, yes. But I mean, it is undefined how long that can be. But it is as long as there is an organization that takes care of it. And let us say that in part of our certification is, in case that DANS itself as an institute would disappear, then the responsibility for the data will shift to the academy and to the funding organization of research. And although this hasn't been finished yet, we are working on a deal with the national archives to then take over. So there is this idea of keeping it forever, as long as that is possible. But you perhaps also are asking about the volumes, or not? Because it will grow and grow and grow.
My question, in some ways, we can see that it is as difficult, the difficult thing in data archiving is to organize the data, to select them, to put them in the proper format, and then to have all the metadata that goes with it.
Yeah.
Once you've done that, it doesn't really matter how long you keep them afterward. You've been doing most of the work is done now. So can we imagine that we are going to keep forever all those data? Or do we have criteria to select some of them? Because
I think, first of all, at the moment there is a self-selection for most areas in the Netherlands, except for archaeology, where it is obligatory. But I would say that for certain areas, it perhaps doesn't make sense to keep data forever. They want to keep data for a limited time period, let us say 10 years, in order to make data replicable, or the results of research replicable. But that also should then be specified at the beginning, to have deselection criteria. And that would be perfectly okay with me. Technically, I do not think it is much of a problem, because all calculations point in that direction. Data growth is, in general, how do you call that?
Ascending.
Yeah, but more rapidly than linear.
Yeah.
Exponential, thank you. And that means that the volumes that you have today will in 5 years' time be negligible to what will be created then. And that is why I do not think that what we have from the past will really be a big burden. We have calculated that in about 10 years' time, the cost of the storage itself is virtually zero in comparison to what new arrives. Is there still time for
another question? Yeah, just short question if possible. Because yes, short. Okay.
It's a short question about yes and no, about openness. My question is, do your system ingest? Does your system ingest to support kind of black data, no access and no metadata? They're just stored.
We do not accept data without any metadata, but I can tell you the absolute bare bones minimum is 4 fields. And if I try to reproduce them correctly. No?
About access to metadata. Do you have metadata in your system, metadata and data sets in your system, where you can't access neither the data nor the metadata?
No, this doesn't. Well, I must say, but this is almost a national secret, that we do have some data that cannot be accessed in the first, perhaps 10, and we do not exactly know till when, because it is the depositor that decides on that. And that is stored offline, etc. You cannot, there is metadata, but even the metadata is not accessible because it's secret.
Openness is mandatory, okay?
But we hope it will be open one day, you know. We still think that this data is of such interest. Otherwise, if it wasn't so interesting, then nobody would bother to keep it secret.
Yeah.